Welcome to Michigan Planning Today. I am your host, Bob Gibbs, and we address planning and zoning and development issues in Michigan and general trends across the country. Today's guest is Andrea Brown, the Executive Director of the Michigan Association of Planning in Ann Arbor. Welcome, Andrea.
Thanks, Bob. Good to be here.
Thank you very much for joining us. Tell us a little bit about the Michigan Association of Planning.
Yeah, so the Michigan Association of Planning is a 501c3 nonprofit membership organization. We're a professional organization, which means that people choose to join our organization, and we provide them with value and benefit for their membership dues. We have an interesting history. We've had a lot of names over the years, and we have a couple distinct sets of membership. One is the professional planner. So a professional planner is someone who is trained and educated as a planner. They typically work for a municipality or a consultant, sometimes as a nonprofit professional as well. And then we have about 1,000 professional and student members of our organization. We have more than 3,000 local elected and appointed officials. So city commissioners or city council members, township board, township supervisor, full planning commissions, full zoning boards, full DDAs. So communities that really recognize the value of getting the education and the information from the professional association so that their officials can be better informed and make sound legal planning and zoning decisions, and the professional planners also receive the same sorts of benefits. So we do what every good professional association does. We have education. So with our professional planners and our officials, we have sort of two different sets of educational content that we provide because they have different educational needs. But we have an annual conference that attracts 500 to 600 people every fall. We have a series of day-long professional development events, primarily for the community planners. And then we have just a series of training programs, planning and zoning essentials, risk management, site plan review to help local officials make better planning decisions.
So it's really a resource for the practicing professional planners, but then also the policymakers and those serving on planning commissions.
Yes, absolutely. And we have more than 4,000 members across the state, although our members are concentrated in urban areas primarily.
What is city planning?
City planning is it's the process of creating great communities. You start with what you have. So a community planner is trained and educated to really look at what the lay of the land is. They'll look at census data and other demographic data. Who lives here? What do they do? How much do they earn? You'll look at their housing. What kind of housing units? How big are they? How old are they? You can see how looking at demographic data would help a community planner know what to consider as they're looking for what the future of that community would be. So planning is really developing the vision for where you want to go, engaging the community, because it isn't just a professional or the officials who are making this plan. Really, it's the community's plan. And so there are a number of community engagement techniques that can be used to involve residents, business owners, nonprofit leaders, anchor institutions, everybody who has really a stake in that community. Getting them involved with the development of the plan throughout the planning process is a good best practice for community planners. So you have your demographics, your community engagement, you'll put your vision together, and ultimately you'll come up with an action plan for how to realize the future that your community has envisioned.
I'm so delighted to hear, because I've been a city planner for a long time.
Yes, you have.
And when I introduce myself, I'm often asked, what is a city planner? Do you really design cities, and do you really design places? Here's a beautiful image of downtown Detroit, which was really planned as a city, and city planners are active in updating and revitalizing the downtown on a regular basis. And are city planners a profession?
Yeah, city planning is a profession, but what we need to remember when looking at the practice of community planning, there are a lot of different professionals that are involved in that process. You might have architects who are looking at a building or a set of buildings and how they're designed and how that fits in with the immediate vicinity. A landscape architect who's going to look at how the natural environment fits with the buildings. Social workers, health professionals, engineers, just a big group of professionals go work together to put together a plan. But planning is a profession. It evolved over a couple of generations and many decades, really. I would say it was initiated really post-industrial revolution, when we began looking at the impacts of industry on so many of our communities, the health issues, air quality, water quality, the tenements of New York, overcrowding, density. Planning really arose out of that. The first zoning ordinance ever established in the United States was in New York City to address those overcrowding, sanitation type issues. From there, Harvard was the first university to offer a graduate degree in urban planning in 1929, followed by Cornell and MIT in the 30s, University of Michigan in 1946, I think, and then a lot more came into being. So as a profession, there have been planning programs, planning curriculums for a very long time, but our profession has really evolved as federal policy has evolved. We've responded in a lot of different ways to federal policies that have really affected the work that we do as community planners. Looking, for example, at World War II. Post-World War II, we had our first housing policies and our first transportation policies that really transformed the way our built environment was structured. Returning vets were given mortgage deals, and the housing industry responded by just building thousands and thousands of homes, but not in the city centers, in the outskirts. About the same time, federal transportation policy created our federal highway system, which was initially created to address future potential war efforts in moving tanks and trucks and the things that are needed to run a war. But now we know that they move people all around our state, all around our country. But both of those federal policies really changed the lay of the land in terms of moving from denser cities and pure rural areas to a suburban development pattern, which in a lot of ways is really good for a lot of people, but it's exacerbated, I guess I would say, some social problems that have always been present, but these newer development patterns of the 50s and 60s and 70s really created some inequities in our communities that community planners are responsible, along with a lot of other people, for addressing. So
here's an image of a master plan for Bloomfield Township, and this was probably led by a professional planner. And tell us about what a master plan is and how do cities get the right and legal authority to do so?
Sure. So planning is enabled by state enabling legislation. So the Planning Enabling Act allows municipalities to develop a plan, and it establishes the things that a community needs to include in that master plan. But a typical master plan, like this one on the screen, is going to look first at what the existing land use patterns are. And then, as I mentioned earlier, it's going to look at demographics. Who lives here now? Who lived here in the past? Who do we think is going to live here in the future? And when we're looking at who might be moving in the future, we're also going to be looking at a changing demographic, possibly, in terms of aging populations, number one. That's one thing that most communities in the United States are looking at, because we really have a a graying of America as the baby boomers age? Are we creating the right kind of housing for a baby boomer? Young baby boomers need something different than an elderly person, but do we have a continuum of housing? Are we planning for a continuum of housing? I think one of the things that most of us really want in our communities that we live in and that we serve is that our parents would be able to stay in our communities for every phase of their life, and that our children, if they choose, can also stay in our communities.
The master plan will help with that. It'll address what land uses should go where in the community, and the streets and transportation and all of that. I want to shift gears to talk a little bit about the new planning process. I think early on planning was kind of top down. But planning now has evolved to more of a public engagement, and a lot of communities use the public process. Talk about this new kind of planning process.
Yeah, so there's two things I think that we need to consider when we're looking at community engagement. Some things that community planners do, some of the actions that community planners are taking to their elected boards and their appointed boards, there are mandated public hearings. A site plan, which is if a new development is coming in, the site plan is a drawing of how the buildings sit on that site, where the parking is located, how traffic gets on and off, where the dumpster for trash collection is located. There are regulations for how sites need to be developed. So a community planner will shepherd that process through. But a public hearing is required for that. On the other hand, if you have a master plan that you're developing where you want to engage the entire community and hear as many voices as you can, because it is a community plan, there are a number of different techniques that can be used today, and I think that community planners have become really quite extraordinary at outreaching to everybody in the community so that everybody has a voice, and there are different approaches that can be taken as well. So you might have a focus group, for example, where you'll bring together individuals who have a specific expertise in a given area or about a certain topic. You might talk to a dozen people and ask them established questions to learn there. You might have a neighborhood meeting in a neighborhood, for example, where perhaps it's a lower income neighborhood where a lot of people may not have cars. You'll take your community meeting right to that neighborhood. You might provide food and child care as well. So one of the things that community planners have become very good at is developing various techniques for hearing from everybody in the community. What happens a lot in communities is you have the squeaky wheels who are often driving a planning process and often leading the ideas that are included in a master plan that aren't necessarily reflective of all of the voices and all of the needs in the community.
Yeah, this is a planning process that the city of Birmingham engaged in about 25 years ago with Andrea Brown, a noted planner out of Miami, where they did the entire master plan in a week in public. And over 4,000 or 5,000 people came through the process. And every day they would do plan alternatives, put them on the wall, and then have the squeaky wheel and everybody observe and comment on the plan. And the next day they would do another plan. And over a period of a week, they developed a whole master plan. This is very common now, isn't it, to plan right in the public?
It is, yes. And the name for that is that process is often referred to as a charrette. Although that is one method of planning, but I wouldn't rule out a longer planning process, particularly given communities that have a lot of changing circumstances or demographics, because it's really important to get that background information so that everybody really understands and has the same sets of information that ultimately they'll be weaving into and creating the plan recommendations from.
Yeah, they're complicated. The issues are complicated.
They are complicated,
very complicated.
Indeed. Yeah.
Here's an example of a master plan where it shows the land uses, the parks, and residential and commercial and all of that, and this is illustrated to let the public understand what it could look like if it were developed. Talk about MAP's top priorities.
Yeah, so community planners across the nation are really facing a lot of challenging topics. Climate and resilience is one. Climate change is real. It's the science is there. We are experiencing globally weather events that are more severe, that are impacting our infrastructure, our livelihoods. So hazard mitigation planning has become more important than ever, really looking at how are we planning for more severe weather in our communities. It's certainly prevalent in our coastal communities, and Michigan has more coastal lands than, it depends on who you talk to, but maybe more than any other state, including California, Florida, and Alaska. So we have a lot of coastline and a lot of potential for damage and for impacts from storms. And we know that the water levels in the Great Lakes right now are higher than they've ever been, which means that communities that in coastal areas really need to be responding to these changing weather patterns in ways that allow for less damage, more mitigative efforts.
And the planners are involved in planning and strategizing of how to address those issues.
Yeah, planners should be definitely at the table for that. The American Planning Association, which is our parent organization, MAP is the Michigan chapter of the American Planning Association, will be releasing in 2020 an infrastructure resilience report, which I'm super excited about. It's part of their PASS series, Planning Advisory Service, which is just one of the best products that the American Planning Association offers. But it will be teaching to how do community planners look when building new infrastructure, new pipes and new roads, to what these new weather events mean, because our calculations for pipe size, for example, and community planners, when we think about where our water to our homes and where our sanitary to and from our homes comes from, planners and engineers consider those things all the time for new development. But climate really can impact the size of pipes if we have a lot more water coming in. So really looking at more innovative ways to plan for infrastructure improvements.
And then, Matt, one of your primary objectives is for housing, to address housing issues. Talk about housing.
Sure. So Michigan and the United States housing crisis time, right? So the recession, which many people say was a one-state recession in Michigan, other states experienced that as well, but we were so severely impacted by the recession. So what happened in the recession was home builders kind of stopped building homes for quite a long period of time, 2008 to 12 or 13. So as we began to claw our way out of the recession, housing starts were still slow. So there's a real pent-up demand for housing. But what happened during that time period, and what happened in the years leading up to that, as I referenced earlier, even the post-World War I housing, much of that was single-family housing designed for a certain segment of our population. But we've continued to build housing in much that same way, a lot of single-family homes, where really in the world that we live in, we need a combination of home types. We need a lot more multiple family housing, and we need affordable housing. And affordable housing is very difficult for home builders who are looking to make a profit, like any business person looking to make a profit. It's very difficult for a home builder or a developer to develop affordable units. Affordable units are almost always going to require some sort of public subsidy. So a challenge with that is we haven't had a relevant housing policy coming out of the federal government in a generation, which is really impacting what's going on the ground, when we know that if we have a great demand for affordable housing, developers can't build it. They're not going to build it if they can't make a profit. No business person would. But how do you balance that? And then coupled with local government, state government, we're all strapped for money. Government is really hurting. I think people really have lost sight of the good that government does. Community planners are usually government professionals, along with a whole host of other professionals who really are trying to advance the public good, to protect the health, safety, and welfare of all residents in Michigan. But but our coffers are really running dry, right? And from Headley and Prop A and state revenue sharing cuts, local government doesn't really have the money to subsidize affordable housing, and the federal government hasn't come through either. So it's a real predicament.
And planners can help with land use and design to accommodate a full range of housing, not just the large single-family homes.
That's correct. And what I would challenge a lot of our communities in Michigan do when looking at some of the other maps that were up is, many of those communities are primarily single-family. We need to be looking at zoning for more multiple families so that all people can live in our community, so that we're providing homes for not just executive, but firefighters and teachers and service workers at McDonald's and Wendy's.
Also, equity and fairness, that's a MAP objective. Tell me about that.
Yeah, so community planners, we have a code of ethics. I'm a certified planner. We have, I think, about 600. You're a certified planner. We have a code of ethics that we are mandated to hew to, and really foundationally to that code of ethics is a charge to make sure that when we plan, we're planning for all. Our American Planning Association just released a Planning for Equity policy guide that I couldn't be more proud of our national organization for taking the lead on that. The chapter has had a social equity policy for a long time, but what we're committed to doing and what our national organization too is committed to doing is showing planners what they can do to make sure that they're leveling the playing field and that they're providing housing and transportation options and access to jobs and quality education for everyone in the community, which usually means we have to work a little bit harder during those public meetings to engage and to find out what various communities within our communities need.
Yeah, and part of that has to do with the challenges that we're facing, and I know that's a major focus for MAP, or future challenges. What's this graph illustrate that you gave me?
Well, this is, I think, for anyone who's familiar with a population pyramid, the one on the left from 1960 shows that we have a lot of younger people, more younger people than older people in our communities. We built schools for these younger people, and they in turn grow up, get jobs, pay into Social Security to far fewer people. Or if you look at the 1960 pyramid on the left, more people paying for fewer people at the top. As that pyramid becomes more equal in terms of the age cohorts in each of the categories, you can see that there's going to be fewer people paying into Social Security, for example, but also, have we built enough housing, as I mentioned earlier, for our seniors?
Here's a map of people in Southeast Michigan, age 66 and plus in the year 2000, and the dark color is where there's a high percentage, the light color is where there aren't many. And this is the same map 2030 from now. You can see almost the entire Southeast Michigan is going to have majority of people 66 and older, and that's something for planners to anticipate and to plan for.
Yeah, that's correct. And it's everything from housing, again, as I mentioned earlier, making sure that we have housing for all ages in our community, but also transportation. We don't drive as much when we're older. How are our seniors going to be getting to their doctor's appointments, to the grocery store? You can't really count on your children as much anymore because a lot of them have moved away. We're such a transient population. So looking at public transit, ride share, dial a ride, things like that. But really, mass transit is one of the things sorely lacking in Michigan generally. A lot of communities have a transit system, but what we don't have, particularly in Southeast Michigan, which is our most populous region of the state, is mass transportation that's connected, that's efficient, that runs regularly, and that can really get people where they go. And this is for seniors as well as folks who don't have or can't drive, getting access to cars or jobs.
Which brings up sprawl. That's an initiative I know that planners are concerned about. What is suburban sprawl, and how are planners addressing it?
Suburban sprawl is a land development pattern that really began in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, but continues now, where most of the housing development is not, and commercial development, and jobs development is not taking place in our core cities any longer, but it is spreading out further and further. So there are a lot of issues with that. One, as you can see in the photograph, it's encroaching on farmland. So as we're looking at how are we going to eat, we look at the climate change and how that might affect our food source. We look at, in Michigan, we don't have a long growing season. So much of the food that we eat in Michigan comes from California or Chile, which requires bringing that food in. So food shed planning is something that's also interesting to the Michigan Association of Planning. But the more that housing development encroaches on arable, high quality agricultural land, the greater danger we're in for losing local food sources.
Andrea, I hear the term placemaking a lot. What is placemaking and how is that different than planning?
Well, placemaking is planning in a lot of ways. I think as we look back at what has happened in Michigan post manufacturing. So we have lost a lot of our manufacturing in Michigan, and we are more nationally as well, but more of a service economy. But there are 500 and some cities and villages in Michigan, and most of those had some sort of manufacturing entity that provided jobs for the folks that lived in that community or around that community. As manufacturing has declined, so have the jobs. And a lot of communities in Michigan are finding themselves a little bit tired, right? So they don't have jobs. When you don't have jobs, you don't have as much money. It's harder to keep your house up to code. Businesses leave the downtown. So a lot of our communities have really experienced economic decline as a result of a decline in the manufacturing industry. Placemaking came about in part to address some of that physical decline. So really looking at how do we invest in primarily it's for cities and villages, although placemaking can happen in townships as well. But how do we invest in our towns to make them prosperous, vital places where people want to be? So it's reimagining and reinventing, usually through capital projects. So we're talking about a park, we're talking about a city center, we're talking about a downtown event space. So oftentimes it's a physical space that is designed and programmed with events and sometimes just street furniture, right? Chairs, movable tables and chairs, but just many, many different ways to bring together people so that we can enliven our public spaces.
Thank you very much for joining us, Andrea. Can you tell us a little more about how people can get involved in MAP? Are the conferences open to the public? Can anybody join and follow you on your website?
Yeah, our conferences are open to anybody. There is a fee, of course. But another way to get involved with planning is to contact your municipality, right? And talk to the planner in your municipality and find out what's going on. What are the issues that your community is facing? Have a sit down. Planners love to talk to residents and share with you their ideas. Pay attention to the newspapers and other ways that public notices come out, and be involved in the planning processes that are going on in your community. Planners really want and need to hear from as many people possible so that robust master plans that meet the needs of the majority of the residents and businesses and anchor institutions in the community can be realized.
Thank you, Andrea, for joining us. Andrea Brown, the Executive Director of the Michigan Association of Planning based in Ann Arbor. And thank you for joining Michigan Planning today. I'm Bob Gibbs, and until next time, thank you for joining us.